He gave up his window seat for an elderly woman. 3 hours later, he was holding evidence that could bring down a $1 billion company. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into a life or death decision. A cybersecurity expert, a mysterious old woman, a dangerous secret buried inside a luxury aviation empire. And the clock is ticking, because if Caleb Harris doesn't act now, hundreds of lives could be lost. Voiceover suggestion: read with tension and emotion. Add subtle ambient jet engine sounds and soft cinematic background music for build-up. All he wanted was the window seat. All she needed was someone to listen. Neither of them knew this flight would change everything. Caleb Harris wasn't the kind of man who believed in fate. He believed in firewalls, encryption, and well-written code. In his world, every problem had a logical cause and a clean solution. That morning, all he wanted was a smooth flight, an empty inbox, and a couple hours of solitude with his noise-canceling headphones, and the window seat he'd carefully reserved weeks ago. But by the end of flight AZ-1745, he would be holding a thumb drive full of secrets that could bring down a $1 billion aviation company because of one small decision made out of kindness. The day started like any other. O'Hare Airport was its usual mess. Long security lines, overpriced coffee, flight delays posted in glaring red on overhead screens. Caleb checked his phone. 7:14 a.m. His flight was on time. Miraculous. He adjusted the strap of his backpack and moved toward the gate, clutching his boarding pass. Seat 28F, window. That seat wasn't random. It was intentional. Symbolic, almost. He'd worked himself to exhaustion for over a year straight. Long hours consulting on cybersecurity contracts for finance firms and government subcontractors. Now, at last, he had landed a lucrative deal with Bradford Aeronautics, a prestigious aviation tech company based in San Francisco. This trip wasn't just business, it was validation. At 37, Caleb had carved out an impressive reputation. From his start in the NSA to the founding of his own firm, Shield Core Security, he'd broken barriers in an industry that still wasn't used to seeing people like him at the top. But no matter how far he got, he still felt it. The weight of being watched, questioned, underestimated. And sometimes, that weight made him long for the peace found only at 35,000 feet, next to a quiet window, above the clouds where no one expected anything. As he boarded the plane and made his way down the narrow aisle, he scanned seat numbers: 26, 27, 28. And that's when he saw her. She stood alone, barely 5 feet tall, her silver hair cut into a neat bob. A cream-colored pantsuit, perfectly tailored. A string of pearls around her neck, not costume jewelry, but real. Her posture straight, shoulders back, but her hands shook as she tried to lift her carry-on into the overhead bin. There were people behind her, sighing. No one moved to help. Caleb didn't hesitate. "Allow me," he said softly, reaching up. He lifted the bag easily into place and gave her a gentle nod. She turned to him, surprised. "Thank you, young man." "Anytime," he replied. She stepped into the row and looked at her ticket. 28E, she said aloud, a slight drop in her voice. Middle seat, right next to Caleb's window. She glanced at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. Barely perceptible. But Caleb saw it. He always saw it. That moment, subtle and fleeting, when someone realized they'd be sitting next to him, and didn't quite know how to feel. Normally, he would have shrugged it off, blocked it out. People carried their biases, and Caleb had long since stopped trying to fight them all. But something about this woman felt different. Her discomfort wasn't hostile, just human. "Would you prefer the window seat?" he asked. She turned to him, surprised. "The clouds are nice this time of day," he added with a small smile. She tilted her head. "That's very kind of you, but are you sure?" "I've seen enough clouds," he said. "Please, it's yours." She paused, really looked at him. Her eyes pale blue and sharp, studied his face as if measuring something deeper. "Thank you," she said. "That's rare." They settled into their seats. She gazed out the window. Caleb relaxed into the middle, pulling out his phone. Then she spoke again. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn Bradford." "Caleb Harris," he replied, offering his hand. Her handshake was firm, confident. "You're in tech," she said. He blinked. "How could you tell?" She smiled. "Sticker residue on your laptop bag, posture of someone who's been at a desk too long, and you're on a Tuesday morning flight to San Francisco, tech capital of the country." Caleb laughed. "You missed your calling as a profiler." "I've spent most of my life watching people," she said. "Eventually, you learn the patterns." As the plane took off and the skyline shrank behind them, the conversation unfolded like a well-worn novel. Evelyn wasn't just sharp. She was curious, layered, warm, without being overly familiar. She asked about his work, his family. Caleb found himself talking more than usual. "My mom passed away 5 years ago," he said, a little quieter. "She raised me and my two brothers alone after my dad walked out." "What did she do?" "She cleaned houses in Highland Park for the wealthy. And now her son is a cybersecurity consultant for aerospace companies." "She would have been proud," Caleb admitted, his throat tightening unexpectedly. "I'm sure she still is," Evelyn said gently. They fell into a companionable silence. Then Evelyn added almost too softly to hear, "My son lives in San Francisco too. But he doesn't know I'm coming." Caleb turned to her. "Why not?" She didn't answer right away, just looked out at the clouds. A few minutes later, the drink cart came rolling by. "Water, please," Caleb said. The flight attendant handed it to him, but carefully, avoiding even the slightest touch of his hand. A familiar slight, subtle but intentional. Before Caleb could say anything, Evelyn spoke up. "I'll have a gin and tonic," she told the attendant. "And please, do remember your training about serving all passengers with equal respect." The flight attendant froze, cheeks flushing. "I didn't mean—" "Don't apologize to me," Evelyn said, motioning to Caleb. "Apologize to him." The attendant mumbled something, then hurried on. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said. "Yes, I did," Evelyn replied. "Complicity through silence is how these things persist." Caleb stared at her, intrigued. "You're not like most people I meet." "Neither are you," she said. As they continued talking, Caleb eventually revealed the reason for his trip. "Bradford Aeronautics," he said. "Their security division has some red flags. They brought in my firm to audit their systems." He saw the faintest smile tug at her lips. "Bradford?" she repeated. "That's interesting." "Yeah, why?" "Because that's my company," she said. "Or it was." Caleb blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" She reached into her bag and handed him a business card. No logo, no title, just a name and phone number. Evelyn Bradford. "I built it from the ground up," she said. "I ran it for 30 years. But 5 years ago, my son, Graham, pushed me out. Boardroom coup, long story." "You're saying you're the founder of the company I'm auditing?" "I'm saying I have reason to believe that the current leadership, my son included, is covering up major safety violations in the navigation systems your team is reviewing." Caleb blinked, the weight of her words settling over him. "That's a serious accusation." "I know, that's why I need help, and why I brought this." She handed him a thumb drive. "It contains test data, email records, internal memos, proof that they've cut corners, bribed officials, and rushed deployment on critical components. Components that, under stress, can fail catastrophically." Caleb stared at the drive. His mind was racing. "I can't promise anything," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for promises," she replied. "Just that you look," Caleb Harris stared at the small silver thumb drive resting in his palm. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was carrying more than just files, more than data. It held something dangerous, something real. He had taken it without thinking, out of a strange mix of instinct and curiosity. But now that the hum of the plane filled the silence between them, he was beginning to realize what he had just agreed to. "You really think your son is risking people's lives?" he asked carefully. Evelyn Bradford's face was turned toward the window, the white-blue glare from the clouds painting her features in soft light. "I don't think," she said. "I know." She didn't sound angry. She didn't sound vengeful. If anything, she sounded tired, like someone who'd carried a truth too heavy for too long. "5 years ago," she began, still looking out at the sky, "I was removed from my own company. I built Bradford Aeronautics from the ground up, from a 5-person shop designing custom flight software to one of the most respected aviation tech companies in North America. I built our first engine prototypes, designed our early flight stabilization systems, and led every safety audit myself for nearly 3 decades." Caleb didn't interrupt. "My son Graham," she continued, "he was always ambitious. Smart, charming, ruthless when he needed to be. The board loved him, investors adored him, and slowly behind the scenes he started painting me as obsolete, overcautious, too traditional for an industry that, according to him, needed to move faster." She turned to Caleb now, her gaze level. "But aviation isn't like tech. You can't skip beta testing when people's lives are 30,000 feet in the air." Caleb nodded slowly. He understood. He'd seen enough cut corners in his field, enough arrogant developers and executives who thought rushing was innovation. "What happened?" he asked. "He convinced the board I was resisting modernization," she said. "And when I raised concerns about the new navigation systems, about redundancy being stripped out, about testing simulations being altered, I was told I was paranoid, that I needed to transition into retirement. And you didn't go quietly." "I went with dignity," she said, "but I didn't stop watching." She told Caleb about the breadcrumbs she'd followed, conversations with engineers who trusted her, quiet warnings from maintenance crews, an anonymous email from a former employee with access to internal documents. Then finally, 3 months ago, a courageous systems engineer sent her the modified specifications of the nav system being installed in several aircraft for commercial testing. "I had it verified by independent analysts," she said. "The conclusions were the same. Under normal conditions, it works fine. But during high-pressure events, electrical storms, power fluctuations, signal loss, it fails. The system can miscalculate altitude, drift off course, and it does so silently. No error flags, no warnings to the pilot." Caleb felt a chill. "How many planes are using it?" "It's still in limited testing," Evelyn said, "but the FAA contract is due for final approval next week. Once that happens, it goes global. Hundreds of jets, thousands of lives." He took a slow breath, trying to steady the storm in his chest. "And you came on this flight because—" "I knew you'd be on it," she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "You're listed as lead consultant for Shield Corps on the Bradford audit," she said calmly. "I still have access to certain company briefings. I knew they were flying you in this morning. So I booked this flight, hoping I might speak with you before the vultures got to you first." He laughed, short, sharp, incredulous. "You engineered a meeting with me on a plane?" "I engineered jets for a living, Mr. Harris," she said with a small smile. This was easy. He looked at the thumb drive again. His thumb rested against the edge. He could almost feel the weight of it pressing through his skin. "This could get me fired," he said. "Yes." "It could destroy my firm." "Yes." "And if I act on it, it'll be your word against your son's. The company will rally around him. I'll be the outsider accusing a CEO based on evidence from a woman they've labeled unstable." "Yes," she said again. "And they'll come after you, hard." He looked up. So why me? Because you offered me your window seat, she said simply. That told me everything I needed to know. The rest of the flight passed in tense silence. Caleb pretended to check his email, but his mind was far from the screen. Every few minutes, he found his eyes drifting to Evelyn, to the clouds, to the thumb drive. When the plane touched down in San Francisco, she stood and adjusted her coat. I'm staying at the Fairmont, she said. Room 1903. If you decide to look at the data and you want to talk, that's where I'll be. Then she was gone, swallowed up by the crowd in the terminal, her elegant silhouette disappearing into the flow of passengers. Caleb stood at baggage claim, the thumb drive burning a hole in his pocket. He had choices. He could ignore it. Focus on the audit, finish the contract, cash the check. Or he could look, but if he did, if the evidence was real, then he'd be holding a bomb, a moral one that couldn't be diffused quietly. He got in his Uber. The sun was rising over the bay as the car glided down the highway. Caleb didn't see the water, didn't see the skyline. He only saw his reflection in the window and the ghost of a man who once tried to speak up and wasn't heard. His father. That night, Caleb sat on the hotel bed, cross-legged, laptop open. It took 2 minutes to decrypt the thumb drive. 3 minutes to realize it wasn't a bluff. By the 10th minute, he was sweating. Charts, reports, altered simulations. Memos between executives discussing acceptable failure thresholds. Correspondence with an FAA official's brother, head of a consulting firm that had suddenly received millions in contracts. And at the center of it all, Graham Bradford, CEO. Evelyn's son. The man who now ran the company Caleb's firm had been hired to protect. At 2:37 a.m., Caleb leaned back against the headboard, his heart pounding. He picked up his phone, opened Evelyn's card. His thumb hovered over the number. He didn't call. Not yet. He needed to think. But what he didn't know, what Evelyn didn't know, was that they were already being watched. From the 47th floor of the Bradford Aeronautics headquarters, Graham Bradford stood in his private office, staring out over the city, a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. He took the bait, said the man behind him, Lawrence Dean, head of security. The old woman gave him the drive. We've confirmed it. Of course she did, Graham muttered. And? Dean asked. What's the move? Graham turned. His smile was sharp, dangerous. Let him look. Let him think he's uncovering something. It'll make it all the more satisfying when we crush him. He took a sip of scotch and walked toward the massive portrait of his father on the wall. Besides it, he said softly, this company doesn't belong to her anymore. It belongs to me. Sometimes the most dangerous truth isn't what people hide. It's what they convince themselves isn't worth exposing. Caleb Harris hadn't slept. It had been 24 hours since he boarded flight AZ-1745 and met Evelyn Bradford. 24 hours since she handed him a thumb drive filled with damning evidence against her own son. 24 hours since he crossed a moral threshold that no amount of encryption could hide him from. Now, seated in a cafe off Union Square, Caleb stared at his untouched coffee while Evelyn sat across from him. Calm, poised, every bit the seasoned engineer and ex-CEO. But her eyes carried something else. A storm. We need to act now, she said. Caleb nodded but didn't look up. What we have may not be enough. They'll discredit you. Say you're bitter. That you're too old, too emotional, too vengeful. I don't care what they say about me, Evelyn replied, but I care what they'll say after a crash, after people die. An insider ally. The only way forward was to get inside. They needed someone within Bradford Aeronautics, someone with access to the company's inner workings, beyond what Caleb could see from his contracted security audit. Evelyn had an idea. There's one person who might help, she said. Michael Thompson, one of my former lead engineers. He's still with the company, quiet, loyal, and he never liked what Graham was doing after I left. Caleb reached out to Michael using an encrypted email alias Evelyn had given him. 3 hours later, they met in a quiet dive bar in the Sunset District. Dim lighting, loud music, and enough noise to keep conversations private. Michael was in his early 40s. Worn face, tired eyes, brilliant mind. He looked like someone who'd been surviving, not thriving. I always knew it would come to this, he told them after Caleb laid out the situation. I've been logging every suspicious directive for months. Red flag memos, altered reports, even a video from a failed simulation they buried. You still have all of it? Evelyn asked. Michael nodded. Backed up, stored offline. Will you give it to us? He hesitated. Graham has security watching all executive communications. If they find out I'm talking to you, we'll protect you, Caleb said. But this is bigger than jobs and reputations. Michael glanced at Evelyn, then Caleb. Meet me tomorrow night. I'll bring everything. The Hidden Project. The next day, in a discreet rented office space, Caleb and Zoe examined the files Michael had provided. That's when they discovered it. Project Horizon. The folder was buried 6 directories deep in an internal server snapshot. What the hell is this? Zoe asked, eyes narrowing. Caleb read aloud from one of the memos. Horizon patching approved for early phase installation. Full Cypher protocol integration pending legal clearance. No further engineer review required. Cypher? Evelyn said sharply, leaning forward. That was a fail-safe software we developed years ago. It was designed to push emergency flight corrections remotely in case of failure. But it had too many security vulnerabilities. We shut it down. Zoe's fingers danced across her keyboard. Looks like Graham reactivated it. Project Horizon is the deployment mechanism. Caleb stood. So, not only are they pushing flawed navigation systems, they're installing a remote control patching tool that hasn't been properly tested, and which can be hijacked. It's a backdoor into any plane using their systems, Evelyn whispered. Unsecured, untested, invisible to the pilots. The room fell silent. Then Caleb muttered, If even half of this gets out, it'll burn the company to the ground. The betrayal. The next morning, Evelyn called Caleb in a panic. They got to Michael. What? He was arrested. Bradford's private security team says he was caught trying to steal proprietary code. They've already sent a statement to the press. Caleb slammed his fist against the wall. They're framing him. And now they've shifted the story, Evelyn said. Instead of talking about safety, the headlines will be about corporate espionage. Zoe appeared in the doorway. They just scrubbed Michael's employee profile from the company site, like he never existed. Caleb paced. They're trying to bury us before we even speak. We need another way, Evelyn said. Someone with reach. The journalist enters Sarah Mitchell, award-winning investigative journalist, known for exposing corruption in big pharma and government defense contractors. Evelyn had crossed paths with her during a Senate committee hearing years ago. She reached out. Sarah responded within the hour. They met at an old publishing house converted into a private co-working space. I've had eyes on Bradford for a while, Sarah said. Too many rapid approvals. Too much lobbying. Something smelled off. Now you're telling me they've revived a dead safety protocol and are hiding failure reports? Among other things, Caleb said. Sarah skimmed the files on the tablet Zoe provided. This is enough to start. But if I go live with it, they'll throw every lawyer in California at me. We have more coming, Evelyn said. We're uploading simulation failure logs, internal videos, and a financial trail to an FAA commissioner's brother. Sarah looked up. Now we're talking. The leak. They uploaded everything to a secure whistleblower portal used by Sarah's media group. She prepared a multi-phase release schedule. Phase 1. Simulation video showing system failure in storm conditions. Phase 2. Internal emails referencing acceptable loss thresholds. Phase 3. Full report on Project Horizon and Cypher vulnerability. The media rollout was timed to hit national airwaves, financial news, and aviation trade publications simultaneously. When the first headline dropped, Bradford Aeronautics accused of hiding flight safety failures, it sent shockwaves. Within hours, FAA launched an inquiry. Bradford stocks dropped 17%. Reporters flooded the company's headquarters. Social media exploded. Caleb watched it unfold from the safe house. "You okay?" Zoe asked. He exhaled. "Number. But this is right." Graham fights back. At Bradford Tower, Graham Bradford stood in front of a dozen flat-screen monitors in his private operations room. "They beat us to it," Alexandra Voss said grimly. "Leak it's controlled," he snapped. "It's calculated. They had help." Media has the full simulation logs now. FAA's breathing down our necks, and shareholders are demanding answers. He looked at his head of security. "Where's Evelyn?" "We lost her trail after she left the Fairmont," Dean replied. "But we believe Harris is still working with her." Graham's face darkened. "Then make it personal." The ambush. That night, as Caleb stepped out of the safe house to take a private call, a van screeched around the corner. He turned just in time to see two men in black rush him. One grabbed his arm, the other reached for his bag. Caleb fought back. Hard. He elbowed one in the face, dropped to the ground, and rolled toward the alley. Zoe opened the door just in time. "Get in!" They slammed the door behind them and sped off. "Tracking devices disabled," Zoe said, breathless. "We're moving locations. Now." Caleb clutched his shoulder, bruised but intact. "They're not trying to silence us through courtrooms anymore." The confrontation. 2 days later, Sarah's final report aired. It included Evelyn on record. "I was erased," she said in the interview, "but I never stopped watching." Bradford Aeronautics was once about safety, about legacy. Now it's about deadlines and profits. And if speaking the truth costs me my name, so be it. Graham responded with a counterstatement. "She's my mother, I love her, but she's wrong." But the damage was done. The FAA halted all approvals. Congressional hearings were scheduled, and whistleblower protections were activated for Caleb and Zoe. Closure. In the aftermath, Bradford Aeronautics was forced to restructure. Graham stepped down. Evelyn was appointed as an interim advisor, under the condition that safety audits would now be fully transparent and reviewed by third-party engineers. Michael was released. Charges dropped. Caleb returned to his firm, but things had changed. He was now a symbol. Invitations to speak, offers from universities, legal interviews. But he stayed grounded, because it wasn't about attention. It was about doing what his father couldn't do in time. The final conversation. On a quiet morning, Caleb met Evelyn at the cafe where it all began. "I was hoping I didn't ruin your life," she said with a soft smile. "You gave it meaning," Caleb replied. She reached into her bag, handed him a card. "Bradford Foundation. We're starting a scholarship program for young engineers who understand the cost of silence. I want you on the board." Caleb took the card. "And the window seat?" he asked, smiling. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "You sure you don't want it this time?" They both laughed. It's easy to fight for the truth when no one's watching. The real battle begins when everyone is. The echo after the explosion. Caleb Harris stood on the rooftop of the old building that had become their makeshift war room for the past week. From this height, the city looked smaller. The sun was rising, casting a golden hue over San Francisco Bay, as if the world didn't just shift on its axis 2 days ago. Below, chaos reigned. Bradford Aeronautics was in free fall. Evelyn's interview had gone viral, Sarah Mitchell's expose had been shared by every major outlet, and the FAA had issued an emergency suspension of all certifications pending investigation. But now that the storm had hit, the silence afterward was heavier than expected. Caleb's phone wouldn't stop buzzing, but it wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. Media requests, legal threats, Anonymous messages, hack attempts on his home router, journalists camping outside his office. His team divided, some inspired, others afraid. He had told the truth, but telling the truth didn't mean the world celebrated you for it. Evelyn's moment of stillness. Downstairs, Evelyn Bradford stared at her reflection in the window pane. Not at her face, but at her eyes. Those blue-gray eyes that once commanded respect in boardrooms and labs. Now they just looked tired. The adrenaline that had kept her upright over the past week had finally faded. In its place was an old familiar ache in her bones, her lungs, her chest. The chemotherapy had done its work, but so had the stress. A soft knock. Caleb stepped in, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You're up early," he said. "Or never really slept," she murmured. He handed her the tea, sitting across from her. They didn't speak for a long moment. The silence was comforting. Then Evelyn finally asked the question she'd avoided since the leak. "Do you think he ever loved me?" Caleb blinked. "Graham?" She nodded. "He did. I think maybe he still does. In the only way he knows how." Evelyn smiled bitterly. "That's the worst part, isn't it? When your own child sees you as the obstacle." "He saw your caution as fear," Caleb said. "Not as strength." "He saw it as weakness," Evelyn corrected, "because he only values control." Graham in the dark. At the Bradford Tower, the offices were half empty. Graham Bradford sat alone in his once grand corner office. The city stretched before him. His portrait would likely be taken down by next week. The silence here wasn't comforting, it was damning. He had been a visionary once, a rising star. Now he was a headline. His legal counsel, Alexandra Voss, sat across from him, flipping through documents with the kind of careful urgency only lawyers mastered. "You're being named in 4 separate lawsuits," she said. 2 from former employees, 1 from the FAA, and 1 class action filing by a pilot union. Graham stared at her. "I gave them innovation. You gave them risk. I made this company global. You nearly made it lethal." He stood, his voice rising. "They don't understand what it takes to win. My mother couldn't see past her legacy. She wanted perfection. The world rewards speed." Alexandra closed the file. "The world also buries those who get people killed." Her words echoed too long in the quiet. Then came the knock. It wasn't security. It was Michael Thompson, released, exonerated, and escorted by the whistleblower task force. Graham looked at him like a ghost had appeared. "You," he said. Michael didn't flinch. "We're here to take your statement. Voluntarily or not." The price of truth. Back at the safe house, Zoe sat cross-legged on the floor, watching 3 screens at once. Code scrolled. Alerts pinged. Backup files duplicated to cold storage. She glanced over at Caleb. "You realize you just tanked a $12 billion company, right?" "Wasn't just me." "No," she agreed, "but you're the one they're putting on camera." She clicked a clip from a morning show. Former NSA cybersecurity specialist Caleb Harris may have risked his career, perhaps even his safety, to expose what could have been one of the greatest aviation safety cover-ups of our time. He sighed. "I didn't do it for this." "I know. But now that the world knows your name, they'll try to control what it means." A rift between alleys. Later that night, Evelyn and Caleb met with Sarah Mitchell again. She had a new idea. "We've been contacted by several aviation families who lost loved ones in crashes, similar to the failure patterns you exposed," Sarah said. "They want to sue, and they want you both to testify." Caleb nodded. "Good, let's do it." But Evelyn hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly. She tried to hide it by adjusting her scarf. "I'm not sure I can," she said softly. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've come this far." "I don't want my final act to be a courtroom brawl," Evelyn said. "I want to rebuild something." I want to leave behind a company that finally learns from its mistakes, not destroy it. Sarah leaned forward. Evelyn, the world only learns when it bleeds first. There was silence. Tension. Caleb turned to Evelyn. You're scared the company won't survive. No, she said. I'm scared it will, without ever changing. Graham's reckoning. Graham sat alone in the cold briefing room of a federal building. No monitors, no whiskey, no power, just a man. And what was left of his name. Michael, now cooperating with investigators, entered with a small tablet. I want to show you something, he said. It was a video, a simulation, one of the failed tests Graham had buried. In the footage, a commercial flight hit by sudden turbulence. The navigation system fails. Alarms glitch, the jet nosedives, the screen fades. Then the camera turns to Robert Thompson, Caleb's father, an old security archive from a company that had worked with Bradford years ago. In the grainy footage, Robert says, I don't care what they say. That component's not ready. If they don't fix it, someone's going to die. The date, 1 week before Flight 1723. Graham closed his eyes. It was the first time anyone had ever shown him what guilt looked like up close. Final choices. Evelyn sat by the window again, wrapped in a blanket. The fog over the bay reminded her of the early days at Bradford, when the company was just 5 engineers and a dream. She wasn't sure how much longer she had left, but she did know this. She couldn't die with her son hating her. So she wrote him a letter. Not a legal statement, not a press release, just a letter. From a mother. To a son. She left it with Caleb. If he ever asks why, she said, give him that. The interview. 2 weeks later, Caleb sat in front of a camera again. This time, it wasn't Sarah's. It was the Senate Oversight Committee. Mr. Harris, the chairman asked, do you believe your actions endangered the company? No, Caleb replied. I believe the company endangered the public. Would you do it again? He thought of his father, Evelyn, Zoe, Michael, the people who had been silenced, the people who had chosen not to be. Yes, he said. Every time. Closure 1 month later, Evelyn passed peacefully in her sleep. Caleb was there. So was Graham. He hadn't spoken since the hearings. He hadn't asked for forgiveness. He just stood by the window where she used to sit and wept. A new perspective. The Bradford Foundation for Ethical Engineering was launched that spring. Caleb chaired the board. Zoe led the cybersecurity division. Michael returned as a safety consultant. The foundation's slogan was simple. Design as if your mother's on board. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system is from inside the room where it broke. The invitation. It had been 3 weeks since Evelyn Bradford passed. The press had quieted. The lawsuits were moving slowly through the courts. FAA regulations were under overhaul, and Bradford Aeronautics, now under emergency executive review, was rebranding faster than it could recover. Caleb Harris had returned to his cybersecurity firm ShieldCore, hoping for some sense of normalcy. But there was no normal anymore. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what he'd done. And then came the email from interim.chair at bradfordaero.com. Subject private meeting request. Urgent Caleb. The board would like to discuss a proposal with you. It's not about revisiting the past. It's about building the future. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., conference room 21B. No press, no lawyers, just truth. Alana Reyes, interim chairwoman. Caleb read the message 3 times. Zoe sat across the room watching him. Let me guess, she said. They want to hire you. I don't know, he replied, but they're asking to meet quietly. Zoe raised an eyebrow. You just helped nearly bring them down. Now they want to break bread? Caleb stood, pacing slowly. Maybe they want to make peace. Or buy silence. Or maybe, he said, they actually want to change. The offer. The next morning, Caleb stepped into the Bradford Tower, not as a contractor, not as a whistleblower, but as someone the company now viewed with reluctant respect. Conference Room 21B was already occupied by 5 people, all wearing various shades of cautious hope. At the head sat Alana Reyes, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a former pilot's posture. "Mr. Harris," she said, standing, "thank you for coming." Caleb nodded, shook her hand, and took a seat. "What is this?" Alana didn't smile. "A proposition." She tapped her tablet and slid it to him. "Executive role, Director of Safety and Systems Ethics status. Independent, autonomous, answerable only to board oversight. Authority, audit all departments, overrule deployments, suspend products. Budget to be determined. Immediate access to internal systems." Caleb stared at the screen. "You want me to work for you?" "We want you to change us," she said plainly. Evelyn was right. This company lost its soul chasing numbers. We need someone who's not afraid of saying no, someone people trust. Caleb looked up. "Why me?" "Because you said no when it cost you everything." A silence hung in the air. Finally, Caleb asked, "What about Graham?" Alana's face darkened slightly. "He's still under investigation, not expected to return, but he left behind shadows, people loyal to him and to his methods. You'd need to navigate that." Caleb slid the tablet back toward her. "I'll think about it." The conversation with Zoe. That night, Caleb met Zoe at a rooftop bar with too much wind and not enough insulation. She sipped her drink, watching him closely. "Let me guess. They're offering you the keys to the kingdom." Caleb nodded. "And?" "I'm tempted." Zoe blinked. "Seriously?" "I spent the last 2 years pointing fingers, fighting from the outside. What if I had the power to actually stop these things before they happened?" She leaned in. "And what if they're setting you up to be a figurehead? A puppet to say, 'Look, we have morals now,' while they continue business as usual behind closed doors?" Caleb didn't answer. "Look," Zoe added more gently, "you want to change the system, I get it. But don't forget, systems have teeth and memories, especially the ones you embarrassed on national television." A voice from the past. 2 days later, a letter arrived at Caleb's office. Handwritten, no return address. He opened it slowly. "Caleb, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. And I'm glad you didn't stop. I spent my whole life building something, and the moment I let my guard down, even for family, it began to decay. You have the chance now to build something stronger. Not perfect, but honest. Don't let fear be your compass. Let your conscience be. I've left one more gift for you. Check the engineering archive under Swan Protocol. Evelyn." "Swan Protocol?" Caleb jumped to his computer, logged into the legacy Bradford server he still had mirror access to. Scanned. There it was. An old blueprint. A design she'd never gotten approval to build. A self-correcting navigation matrix that was designed to adapt, not just repeat rules, but learn, with human override capabilities baked in. It was revolutionary and completely shelved. The second offer. 2 days later, Caleb returned to Bradford Tower. This time, he brought blueprints. Alana met him in the executive lab, where most former CEOs rarely ventured. "This is Evelyn's Swan Protocol," he said. "It's what she envisioned for the future." Alana reviewed it with a senior engineer beside her. After 20 minutes of quiet reading, she looked up. "This is brilliant." "It's expensive," Caleb added. "Slow to build. Requires a rework of most current systems." "Still, it's brilliant." She looked at him. "Let's build it." Caleb hesitated. "I'll need Zoe." "Then bring her." The ghost returns. But not everyone was pleased. From an estate in Napa, Graham Bradford watched the news silently. Bradford Aeronautics hires whistleblower Caleb Harris as Director of Ethics and Safety. His glass of bourbon trembled slightly in his hand. "They're giving him my company," he said almost to himself. A former legal advisor sat beside him. "They're trying to survive. That leak nearly destroyed the entire supply chain." Graham's expression darkened. "Let them survive. But I'm not done yet. Building something new." The months that followed were both exhilarating and brutal. Caleb worked with Zoe to build an internal oversight department from scratch. They created anonymous reporting systems, mandatory code reviews, psychological evaluations for leadership hires, and independent testing partners. The Swan Protocol entered prototype phase. Bradford began to shift from a company known for speed to one known for integrity. Stock prices dipped at first, but then investors returned, and with them, trust. One last letter. On the one-year anniversary of Evelyn's death, Caleb received one more item, a copy of her unpublished memoir left in the hands of her attorney. Its title, The Window Seat. He smiled, and in its final page she had written, "You never know when a moment of kindness might seat you beside destiny, so always leave room, especially by the window. It's easy to burn down a corrupt system. Much harder to rebuild something worth standing in its place." 6 months later, the buzz of fluorescent lights hummed over the open floor of the new Safety and Systems Ethics Division at Bradford Aeronautics. Glass walls, whiteboards scribbled with code and questions, teams working 18-hour shifts. In the center, Caleb Harris stood before a 3D model of the Swan Protocol Flight Core, presenting updates to the board. His tone was confident but measured. Phase 2 passed every fail-safe simulation. The adaptive response algorithms held under 12 emergency scenarios. "We're ahead of schedule, but I recommend delaying field testing until the redundant matrix is revalidated." There was a pause. Alana Reyes, still interim chair, smiled faintly. "Delaying for safety? That's a sentence I haven't heard in years." There were a few tight chuckles in the room, but across the table not everyone was amused. Brent Mallory, a senior board member and major investor, leaned forward. "We've delayed long enough. Our competitors are closing the gap. Delay this much longer and we won't have a company left to protect." Caleb met his gaze. "Then maybe it shouldn't exist." Silence, and then Caleb added, "I'm not here to preserve what Bradford was. I'm here to make sure what comes next doesn't kill people." Cracks beneath the surface. Later that evening, in the quiet of his office, Zoe entered with her tablet under one arm, eyes guarded. "We need to talk." Caleb looked up from the simulation logs. Zoe shut the door behind her. "You're burning out the team." He blinked. "We're making progress." "At what cost?" "They're afraid to challenge you. You've gone full Evelyn, minus the part where she knew when to let people breathe." He leaned back, exhaling. Zoe continued, "This was supposed to be a revolution, but you're starting to look more like the people we overthrew." That stung. But maybe? She wasn't wrong. Shadows in the light. 2 weeks later, during a quarterly internal audit, Caleb stumbled upon something odd. A new subcontractor, Creston Dynamics, had been quietly greenlit to supply gyroscopic components for the Swan prototype. He hadn't approved them. When he asked procurement who had, he was told, "The Executive Finance Committee signed off." He pulled the contract and saw Graham Bradford's name. Not directly, of course not, but a holding company, Westridge Technologies, had been granted special influence by legacy shareholder privileges. And Westridge was Graham's creation. A ghost returns. He confronted Alana immediately. "You told me he was done, that he wasn't coming back." Alana looked away. "We tried to keep him out, but he owns too many shares through shell corporations. Legally, he has a voice, and he's been using it." Caleb's jaw clenched. "Then he's still in control." "No," Alana said firmly, "but he's still dangerous." The line between lead and follow. That night, Zoe found Caleb in the testing chamber, alone, watching simulations on loop. Over and over, the system succeeded. And in one rare edge case, it failed. "Still at it?" she asked. He didn't respond. Zoe sat beside him. "You know," she said softly, "the more I look at this, the more I realize Evelyn didn't just build Swan to save lives. She built it because she knew leadership requires sacrifice, even of your ideals." Caleb finally turned. "I just wanted to build something good." "You are, but you can't do it alone. You need allies, not acolytes." He swallowed hard, then nodded. A decision under fire. The following week, Caleb was invited to speak at the World Aviation Safety Summit in London. A keynote. Global stage. The same one Graham had stood on 5 years earlier. His instinct was to say no. He hated the spotlight. But Zoe insisted. "This is your chance to set the new tone. Not just for us, but for the whole damn industry." So he went. The speech was raw, honest, unpolished. "I'm not here to promise perfection. I'm here to promise we'll listen when something feels wrong. Because the day we stop listening, that's the day we start crashing again." When he left the stage, people stood, some in applause, some in fear. He didn't care. It wasn't about pleasing them. It was about reminding them that conscience mattered more than compliance. Graham's final move back in the U.S., Graham Bradford made one final attempt to reclaim his legacy. He called a private press conference at his vineyard in Napa. He presented himself as calm, reformed. "Proud of my son's work," he said. Proud of the company's evolution. Then he offered a warning. "But we must be careful not to let moral purity paralyze innovation. The world moves fast. If we slow down too much, we may never catch up." It was a subtle jab, wrapped in civility. But Caleb heard it clearly. So did the board. So did Zoe. And so did every engineer who remembered what happened the last time the world moved too fast. Full circle back. At the office, Caleb found an envelope on his desk. It was old, yellowed, Evelyn's handwriting. "For when it gets hard, for when you're tempted to quit or to compromise." Inside was a note. "Leadership is lonely, but don't forget, truth doesn't need a crown, it only needs a voice. Be that voice even when no one listens. Especially then." Caleb grows into the role. In the months that followed, Caleb fired Creston Dynamics and launched a full review of all hidden Graham-linked accounts. Promoted 2 junior engineers who had challenged his testing logic publicly. Created an anonymous challenge system. Anyone could question a decision, no rank required. Brought in external ethics panels to review his own team. And most of all, he listened. Even when it was hard. Even when it hurt. Legacy in motion. The Swan protocol launched 1 year later on a test flight with no media coverage, no fanfare. Just a plane, a pilot, and a system that worked. Zoe watched the data stream in real time beside Caleb. "Looks clean," she said. Caleb nodded, then smiled. "I think she would have been proud." Zoe looked at him. "So am I. True change never begins with perfection. It begins with courage. The world watches." The launch of the Swan protocol didn't go unnoticed. 1 month after the first successful test flight, the International Aviation Council requested a global safety symposium to examine its implications. 47 countries, hundreds of engineers, thousands of lives at stake. They wanted one person to open the event. Caleb Harris. But Caleb wasn't sure he wanted the spotlight anymore, not after everything. Zoe found him in the hangar where engineers were doing stress tests on Swan's adaptive module. "You're really thinking of skipping it?" she asked. He didn't look up. "I didn't build this for applause." "You didn't build it alone," she said gently. "This moment doesn't just belong to you. It belongs to Evelyn, to your father, to Michael, to everyone who ever got shut out for doing the right thing." She handed him the invitation letter. "Besides," she smirked, "you're the only one stubborn enough to stand up there and call out the entire industry while wearing a hoodie." Graham's final stand. Somewhere in a high-rise office in Singapore, Graham Bradford watched the global news. The Swan Protocol is now being reviewed for integration into the Airbus 920 series. His jaw tightened. Across from him, a former investor spoke quietly. There's still a path back for you if you apologize. Publicly support the changes. Graham turned. I didn't lose because I was wrong, he said flatly. I lost because the world got scared of moving too fast. But Caleb gave them something better, the investor said. He gave them trust. Graham stared at the television. On screen, Caleb in front of a whiteboard explaining adaptive learning fail-safes to a room full of young engineers. I gave them power, Graham whispered. He gave them rules. The keynote. The Global Safety Summit was held in Geneva. The main hall was built like an arena, clean lines, glass ceiling, tech everywhere. Caleb stood backstage, heart pounding. His hands trembled slightly. It reminded him of his first day presenting at the NSA. Zoe stood beside him. You know, she said, this is probably being broadcast in over 100 countries. Helpful, he deadpanned. She grinned. Don't try to be perfect. Just tell the truth. That's your superpower. The lights dimmed. A voice echoed, Please welcome Caleb Harris, Director of Ethics and Systems Integrity at Bradford Aeronautics. Applause, spotlight. Walk to the podium, deep breath. The speech. Caleb looked out over the sea of eyes. Young engineers, seasoned regulators, executives, activists, survivors, families of crash victims, all waiting. He didn't read from a screen. He just spoke. I wasn't supposed to be here. Not as a leader, not as a face of anything. I started as the guy who tested lines of code and looked for gaps others didn't see. And then one day, I offered an elderly woman my window seat. That small moment, it led to one of the most important truths I've ever helped bring to light. It also cost me comfort, security, peace. But it gave me something greater, the chance to build better. I'm not perfect. Neither is the system I work in. But perfection was never the goal. The goal was to care enough to stop, look again, and ask harder questions. To demand that safety isn't the last thing we check, it's the first thing we design. The Swan Protocol isn't a product, it's a promise. That every life matters. That silence isn't neutral, and that courage isn't about being unafraid, it's about acting even when you are. We can build aircraft that fly higher, faster, farther. But if they're built on fear, on silence, on shortcuts, then we're only moving closer to the next tragedy. So let's build different. Let's build boldly. Let's build like someone we love is on board, because someday someone will be. There was a long pause. Then the audience stood, and the room erupted in applause. Backstage. When Caleb stepped off stage, Zoe was waiting. So were 4 young engineers from Brazil, India, Kenya, and South Korea. One of them, a girl no older than 22, held a notebook. Mr. Harris, she said, voice trembling, I study avionics in Sao Paulo. I want to design safety systems. Your work. Saved lives we don't even know yet. Caleb smiled gently. You'll do more than I ever could. A letter revisited. Back at his hotel that night, Caleb opened his suitcase. Inside, tucked between folders, was the now-worn envelope Evelyn had left behind. He opened it again. Truth isn't a destination, it's a direction. Keep walking toward it, even if it means walking alone. He looked out at the Geneva skyline. He wasn't alone anymore. The new flight. 3 months later, the first Swan-equipped commercial aircraft flew from San Francisco to Tokyo. On board were a crew that had been briefed on every fail-safe passengers who had read about the system and felt safer, and a young girl who, like Caleb once had, looked out the window dreaming of the sky. Her mother beside her whispered, "This one's safer." A man named Caleb helped make it that way. Final reflection. Zoe and Caleb sat on a park bench near the shoreline. The wind was soft, the waves quiet. I never asked, she said. Do you ever regret it? He was quiet for a moment. Then, not for a second. She nodded, then asked, So what's next? He looked at her, a soft smile forming. We keep building. Life lesson. Small actions, big consequences. Sometimes changing the world doesn't begin with a loud speech or a brilliant invention. It begins with a small, quiet moment of kindness. Caleb Harris never planned to become the face of aviation reform. All he did was offer his window seat to an elderly woman on a routine flight. But that act opened a door to truth, to courage, and to a path where doing the right thing would come at great personal cost. Through his journey, we learned that integrity isn't just about standing up when it's easy, but when it's lonely, inconvenient, or dangerous. Systems don't change by accident. They change when ordinary people refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Whether you're a software engineer, a mechanic, a student, or a parent, your voice matters. Your refusal to look away might be the one thing that prevents disaster or saves a life you'll never meet. Sometimes offering your seat means taking a stand. Real-life application. In real life, corporate negligence has led to tragic events, like the Boeing 737 MAX crashes or Theric 25 accidents, where flawed systems passed through unchecked because speaking up was risky. Caleb's story is fiction, but it's rooted in truth. Engineers, analysts, and insiders often spot the warning signs before anyone else. If you work in tech, aviation, healthcare, or any high-stakes industry, remember this. Your ethical compass is just as vital as your technical skills. Learn how to file internal reports, document concerns, and understand whistleblower protections. And if you're in a leadership position, create a space where dissent isn't punished, but welcomed. The safety of thousands might one day depend on whether someone felt safe enough to raise their hand and say, "This isn't right." Build systems with accountability. Build cultures with courage. Because in the real world, the stakes are just as high.